Hello, my friend. Welcome back. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Are you in a quiet room with rain outside? Maybe you are lying in bed, letting the day fade away. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Tonight, we travel back to a time when iron met faith, when men in armor rode across continents believing God himself commanded their swords. This is the story of medieval knights and the Crusades. It is a story that spans 3 centuries, from the late 1000s to the 1200s. Touches 3 continents. It involves millions of people, from peasant farmers to kings, from monks to warriors. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself standing in the year 1095, in a town called Clermont in southern France. The air is cold. November wind cuts through your cloak. Around you, thousands of people have gathered in an open field. They are silent, waiting. On a wooden platform stands Pope Urban II, the most powerful religious figure in Western Europe. His voice carries across the crowd like thunder. He speaks of Jerusalem, the holy city, the place where Christ walked and died. He says it has fallen into the hands of infidels, of Muslims who do not worship the Christian God. He says Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem are being attacked, murdered, their bodies left in the desert sand. His voice rises. He calls every able man to take up arms, to march east, to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. And he promises something extraordinary. Anyone who dies on this holy journey will have all their sins forgiven. Heaven itself awaits. The crowd erupts. Men tear strips from their clothing and sew them into crosses. They pin these crosses to their chests. They shout a phrase that will echo through history, Deus vult, God wills it. But this moment did not appear from nowhere. To understand the Crusades, we must first understand knights. We must understand how Christianity shaped medieval Europe. We must understand why thousands of men would leave their homes, their families, their lands, and march thousands of miles into hostile territory. We must understand the world they came from. Medieval Europe in the 1000s was a place of small kingdoms, constant warfare, and deep religious devotion. Society was organized into 3 groups: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the knights; and those who worked, the peasants. This system was called feudalism. A knight served a lord served a king served God. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a role. Knights were not born. They were made. A boy of noble birth would begin training at age 7. He became a page, learning manners and basic combat. At 14, he became a squire, serving a knight directly, caring for armor and weapons. At 21, if he proved worthy, he would kneel before his lord. A sword would touch his shoulder. He would rise as a knight. This was more than a military rank. It was a sacred calling. Knights swore oaths to protect the weak, defend the church, and live by a code of honor called chivalry. But reality was messier than ideals. Knights were also violent men. They burned villages. They killed for land and power. The church struggled to control them, so church leaders created rules. They declared certain days as peace of God, when fighting was forbidden. They channeled knightly aggression toward external enemies instead of internal conflicts. This is where our story truly begins. The Crusades were born from this tension between faith and violence, between the ideal knight and the brutal warrior. They promised redemption through holy war. They offered adventure, wealth, and salvation all at once. Now let us begin. Long before the First Crusade, the world was already divided. Christianity dominated Western Europe. Islam controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Between them lay the Byzantine Empire, a Christian realm centered in Constantinople. It was ancient, wealthy, and sophisticated. People spoke Greek, not Latin. They followed Orthodox Christianity, not Roman Catholicism. Western Europeans viewed Byzantines as strange cousins, Christians but not quite like them. For centuries, these 3 civilizations coexisted. Trade routes connected them. Ideas flowed between them. Muslim scholars preserved ancient Greek texts that Europe had forgotten. Jewish communities thrived in Muslim Spain. Pilgrims from Europe traveled to Jerusalem without major conflict. But in the 1070s, something changed. A new power emerged from Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. They were recent converts to Islam, fierce warriors on horseback. They swept through the Middle East, conquering lands that had been Byzantine for centuries. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks destroyed a Byzantine army. They captured the Byzantine emperor himself. This shocked the Christian world. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, was now vulnerable. Its territories shrank. Its wealth diminished. Its emperor, Alexios I, faced enemies on all sides. He needed help. So in 1095, he sent envoys west to Pope Urban II. He asked for mercenaries, soldiers to fight the Seljuks. Urban saw an opportunity. He saw a way to unite quarreling European kingdoms under one cause. He saw a chance to assert papal authority over the Eastern Church. He saw a way to redirect knightly violence away from Christian lands and toward a common enemy. And he genuinely believed Jerusalem should be in Christian hands. Western Europe in 1095 was ready for his message. The population was growing. Younger sons of nobles had no land to inherit. Feudal law gave everything to the firstborn. These younger brothers, trained as warriors but with no estates, sought glory and fortune elsewhere. The crusade offered both. Religious fervor was intense. People believed in literal heaven and hell. They believed saints performed miracles. They believed relics, pieces of holy objects, held divine power. Pilgrimage to sacred sites could cleanse sin. And Jerusalem was the most sacred site of all. It was where Christ was crucified and resurrected. Controlling Jerusalem meant controlling the very ground where salvation was won. When Urban delivered his speech at Clermont, he spoke to these desires. He painted Muslims as enemies of God. He described atrocities against Christians, some real, many exaggerated. He promised that Crusaders would receive indulgences, complete forgiveness of sins. This was revolutionary. Previously, forgiveness required penance, confession, and prayer. Now it could be earned through holy war. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not just knights answered the call. Peasants, merchants, even children eventually joined crusades. Entire families sold their possessions. They sewed crosses onto their clothes. They prepared for a journey most would never return from. But who were these early crusaders? Many were genuinely pious, believing they served God. Some sought adventure, escaped from boring rural life. Others wanted wealth and land in the East. Some were criminals hoping to escape punishment. Most were a mix of all these motivations. The first wave, now called the People's Crusade, departed in 1096 before the official knightly armies. Led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants marched east with almost no supplies or training. They looted their way through Europe, attacking Jewish communities in Germany. They believed Jews, like Muslims, were enemies of Christ. These pogroms were horrific, entire communities massacred. When these peasant crusaders reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the professional army he requested. He quickly ferried them across into Seljuk territory. They were slaughtered almost immediately. Few survived. The real crusade, the knightly armies, departed shortly after. They were better organized, better equipped, and far more dangerous. They gathered in Constantinople in 1096 and 1097. There were 4 main armies from different regions of Europe. Each was led by powerful nobles: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Normandy. These men were not unified under one commander. They often quarreled. They had different goals, but they shared one mission: reach Jerusalem and take it from Muslim control. The stage was set. The armies assembled. The journey that would reshape medieval history was about to begin. The Crusader armies that gathered in Constantinople were unlike anything the world had seen. Imagine tens of thousands of armored men, horses, wagons, and camp followers stretching for miles. The Byzantines watched with suspicion. Emperor Alexios wanted soldiers to help reclaim his lost territories. Instead, he got independent Western armies who barely respected his authority. Before allowing them to cross into Asia Minor, Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty. He wanted assurance that any lands they conquered would be returned to the Byzantine Empire. Most Crusader leaders swore these oaths reluctantly. They resented the requirement. Already, tension simmered between Western Crusaders and their Eastern Christian hosts. The first major test came at Nicaea in 1097. This city had been a Byzantine stronghold before falling to the Seljuks. The Crusaders laid siege. They built siege towers and bombarded walls. But before they could storm the city, Byzantine forces negotiated a surrender directly with the Seljuk garrison. The Turks opened gates to Byzantine troops, not Crusaders. This enraged the Western Knights. They had fought and bled, and now they were denied the chance to plunder. This pattern of mistrust would repeat throughout the crusade. From Nicaea, the armies marched south through Anatolia. The landscape was harsh, dry mountains and scorching heat. They faced constant harassment from Turkish mounted archers. These warriors fought differently than European knights. They rode light, fast horses. They shot arrows while retreating. They refused to meet the Crusaders in open battle. Instead, they struck and vanished like desert wind. At Dorylaeum in July 1097, the Turks launched a massive ambush. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky. Crusader horses screamed and fell. Men died in their armor, baking in the sun. But the Crusaders held formation. Their heavy cavalry, when it finally charged, was devastating. The Turks broke and fled. The Crusaders had won, but they learned a hard lesson. This was not European warfare. The enemy was elusive, skilled, and adapted to this land. The march continued. Supplies ran low. Men ate their horses. They boiled leather belts. Disease spread through the camps. Some turned back, unable to endure, but the core armies pushed forward. Their faith drove them. Their vows bound them. In October 1097, they reached Antioch, one of the oldest Christian cities in the world. It was now held by Muslims. Antioch was massive, surrounded by walls that stretched for miles, protected by mountains on one side. Taking it seemed impossible. The siege lasted 8 months. Winter came. The Crusaders camped in mud. Food ran out entirely. Men resorted to eating grass, tree bark, even corpses. Chronicles describe knights so weak they could barely lift their swords. Morale collapsed. Deserters fled in the night. Some leaders considered abandoning the entire crusade. But in June 1098, betrayal saved them. A Muslim guard named Firas, angry at his commander, agreed to open a gate. On the night of June 3rd, Crusaders climbed ladders into the city. By dawn, Antioch was theirs. The slaughter was terrible. Crusaders killed every Muslim they found. Men, women, children. Blood ran in the streets. This was holy war, and mercy was not part of it. Yet victory was brief. Days later, a massive Muslim relief army arrived, led by Kerboga of Mosul. Now the Crusaders were trapped inside Antioch, besieged themselves. Starvation returned. Hope faded. Then came a miracle, at least to the Crusaders. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had visions of Saint Andrew. The saint told him where to find the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. Following his directions, they dug beneath a church floor. They found a spearhead. Whether genuine or planted, it reignited faith. Men believed God was with them. On June 28th, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to face Kerboga's army. They should have been destroyed, weak and outnumbered. But Muslim unity was fragile. Different emirs distrusted each other. When the Crusaders charged, some Muslim units retreated without fighting. The line broke. Kerboga fled. Against all odds, the Crusaders won again. Antioch became a Crusader state, ruled by Bohemond. This violated the oath to Alexios, but Bohemond did not care. He had carved out his own kingdom. The Byzantine emperor was furious but powerless. The crusade was fracturing. Different leaders pursued different ambitions. Still, the goal remained Jerusalem. In early 1099, the remaining armies marched south along the coast. They passed through lands that had not seen European armies in centuries. They took cities, made alliances, and left garrisons behind. By June 1099, 3 years after leaving Europe, the Crusaders stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city was held by Fatimid Muslims from Egypt. The Crusaders had marched through hell to reach this moment. Now the final test awaited. Jerusalem in June 1099 was a city of stone and faith. Its walls were ancient, thick and high. Inside lived Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. The city's Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, prepared for siege. He expelled Christians, fearing they would aid the Crusaders. He poisoned wells outside the walls. He gathered supplies and fighters. The Crusader army was smaller now, perhaps 15,000 fighting men. Many had died. Many had stayed behind to hold conquered cities. But those who reached Jerusalem were hardened veterans. They had survived 3 years of war, disease, and hunger. They were so close to their goal they could see the dome of the rock glittering in the sun. The siege began, but the Crusaders faced a problem. Jerusalem sat on high ground with few water sources nearby. The summer sun was merciless. Men died of thirst. Horses died. The Crusaders had no siege equipment, no towers to scale the walls. They attempted a direct assault on July 13th and were repelled with heavy losses. Then fortune turned. 6 ships arrived at the port of Jaffa, carrying supplies and timber. Genoese sailors brought skills in siege engineering. The Crusaders built 2 massive siege towers, wooden structures on wheels that could roll up to the walls. They worked day and night, every man contributing. Knights hauled timber alongside peasants. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, the siege towers rolled forward. Defenders rained arrows, stones, and Greek fire, a flaming liquid that clung to wood and flesh. But the Crusaders pushed on. By midday, 1 tower reached the northern wall. A bridge dropped. Crusaders poured across. Godfrey of Bouillon was among the first to step onto the ramparts. The walls were breached. Crusaders flooded into Jerusalem. What followed was one of the bloodiest massacres in medieval history. Contemporary chronicles describe streets flowing with blood up to the ankles. Crusaders killed Muslims indiscriminately. They burned the main synagogue with Jews locked inside. Eastern Christians, despite being fellow believers, were not always spared. The slaughter lasted for days. When it ended, Jerusalem was nearly empty of its original inhabitants. The Crusaders gathered at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to be the site of Christ's tomb. They wept, prayed, and gave thanks. To them, this was justice, the rightful restoration of Christian control over the holy city. Now came the question of governance. Who would rule Jerusalem? Most leaders wanted to return home. They had fulfilled their vows. But someone had to stay and organize defense. The clergy argued Jerusalem should be ruled by the church. Knights insisted it needed a military king. The compromise was Godfrey of Bouillon. He refused the title of king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a distinction without much difference. He ruled as king in all but name. Godfrey's reign was brief. He died in 1100, possibly from illness. His brother Baldwin succeeded him and did accept the title of king. Baldwin I was a pragmatist. He understood the Crusader states could not survive through faith alone. They needed strategy, alliances, and infrastructure. The Crusaders now controlled a thin strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast. They established 4 main Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These states were surrounded by Muslim territories. They were constantly threatened. To survive, the Crusaders built castles, massive fortresses of stone that still stand today. Croix de Chevaliers, Margate, and dozens of others dotted the landscape. These castles were engineering marvels, designed to withstand siege with concentric walls, hidden passages, and massive cisterns. They also relied on military orders, new organizations that combined monasticism with warfare. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller became the Crusader states' professional armies. Templars wore white mantles with red crosses. Hospitallers wore black with white crosses. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their mission was violence in God's name. They were warrior monks, disciplined and fearless. The Crusaders also learned to coexist with their Muslim neighbors. Not all interactions were hostile. Trade continued. Truces were negotiated. Some Crusader lords even formed alliances with Muslim rulers against other Muslims. The political landscape was complex, shifting, and pragmatic. European settlers arrived, trying to recreate European feudalism in the Levant. They built churches, established laws, and imported European customs. But the population was mixed. Muslims and Eastern Christians outnumbered European settlers. Many Crusaders adopted local customs, wearing lighter clothing, bathing regularly, eating local foods. Some learned Arabic. They became a hybrid culture, European in identity but increasingly influenced by the East. Yet danger was constant. Muslim powers, initially fractured, began to unite. Leaders like Imad ad-Din Zengi saw the Crusader states as foreign tumors to be removed. He conquered Edessa in 1144, the first major Crusader loss. This shocked Europe and triggered the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, was a disaster. Led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, it achieved nothing. The armies quarreled, made poor decisions, and were defeated in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land. It ended in humiliation. The Crusader states endured, but cracks were forming. Power was consolidating, but so was resistance. For a brief period in the mid-1100s, the Crusader states experienced stability and even prosperity. This was their golden age, though it would be short. Jerusalem became a city of pilgrimage again, but now under Christian rule. European nobles visited, bringing wealth and prestige. Churches were built or rebuilt. The dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was renovated. Monasteries sprang up throughout the kingdom. Daily life in Crusader Jerusalem was a blend of cultures. In the markets you could hear Latin, French, Arabic, Greek, and Armenian. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established trading quarters. They exported goods from the East: spices, silk, precious stones, perfumes. These Italian city-states grew rich from Crusader commerce. The Crusader aristocracy lived in relative luxury. They built palaces and held courts. They sponsored art and literature. Chronicles and histories were written. Songs celebrating Crusader victories circulated in Europe. Troubadours sang of brave knights fighting for Christ. Knights in the East developed their own culture, distinct from European knighthood. They were called Polanes, natives, by newly arrived Europeans who saw them as too orientalized. These Eastern Crusaders dressed in flowing robes. They ate with local spices. They appreciated Arab poetry and music. They negotiated with Muslim leaders without hatred, seeing them as political rivals rather than satanic enemies. This practical coexistence scandalized some European visitors. Bernard of Clairvaux, a prominent monk, wrote angrily that Crusaders had become soft, corrupted by luxury and tolerance. He wanted pure holy war, not diplomacy. But the settlers understood survival required pragmatism. The military orders reached their peak influence. The Templars became bankers, managing wealth for pilgrims and nobles. They developed an early form of checks, allowing travelers to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land. They built a network of fortresses. Hospitaller knights ran hospitals, caring for sick pilgrims while also fighting in battles. These orders answered only to the Pope, not to local kings. This gave them independence and power. They could ignore royal commands if they believed it served the greater good. This sometimes caused friction, but it also provided stability. When kings were weak, the orders held the Crusader states together. Agriculture was developed. Crusaders introduced European farming techniques. They planted vineyards and olive groves. Sugarcane became a major crop, refined in mills and exported to Europe. Crusader sugar was prized for its quality. The economy grew. Castles were not just military installations but administrative centers. Lords held court, collected taxes, and dispensed justice. Peasants, both Christian and Muslim, farmed the surrounding lands. Many Muslim peasants continued under Crusader rule much as they had under previous Muslim rulers. Their daily lives changed little. Lords changed, but the rhythm of planting and harvest continued. Cities like Acre and Tyre became cosmopolitan ports. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked, unloading pilgrims and goods. Streets were crowded with sailors, merchants, prostitutes, soldiers, monks, and adventurers from a dozen lands. Taverns served wine from Cyprus. Bathhouses operated in the Eastern style, which scandalized some European visitors but were enjoyed by locals. Architecture flourished. The Crusaders built in the Romanesque style but incorporated local materials and techniques. Churches featured rounded arches and thick walls. But they also used local stonemasons who added decorative elements from Islamic art. The result was a unique hybrid style. Intellectual exchange occurred, though less than it might have. Some Europeans learned from Arab scholars. Medical knowledge was superior in the East. Arab doctors understood surgery, anatomy, and pharmacology better than their European counterparts. Some of this knowledge filtered back to Europe through returning Crusaders and translated texts. However, most Crusaders were not scholars. They were warriors and administrators. The potential for greater cultural exchange was largely missed. Language barriers remained significant. Religious prejudice limited interaction. Most Europeans saw Muslims as infidels to be fought, not teachers to learn from. The height of Crusader power came under King Baldwin III and King Amalric I in the mid-1100s. Baldwin III was a capable military leader. He expanded territory and maintained alliances. Amalric attempted to conquer Egypt, seeing it as the key to regional dominance. His campaigns failed, but they demonstrated ambition. During this period, the Crusader states fielded armies of several thousand knights plus infantry. They controlled key ports and trade routes. They collected significant tax revenue. They seemed permanent, a new fixture in the Eastern Mediterranean. But beneath the surface, problems grew. The Crusader population was small. European immigration slowed. The states relied on constant reinforcement from Europe, but fewer came. Succession crises weakened royal authority. Kings died young, often from disease. Regencies and child kings created instability. And in the Muslim world, a new leader was rising. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Europeans would call him Saladin. He would change everything. Understanding how the Crusader states actually functioned requires looking beyond battles and kings. These were complex societies trying to survive in hostile territory. Their systems of governance, economy, and military organization reveal how precarious their existence truly was. The feudal system imported from Europe was adapted to Eastern realities. The king of Jerusalem theoretically ruled supreme, but his power was limited. Below him were vassals, lords who held fiefs in exchange for military service. These vassals swore homage but maintained significant independence. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was more of a federation than a centralized state. The High Court of Jerusalem was the kingdom's most important institution. It consisted of the king and his major vassals. This court made collective decisions on war, succession, and law. The king could not act unilaterally. If vassals disagreed, they could refuse to follow royal commands. This checks and balance system prevented tyranny but also weakened unified response to threats. Below the nobility were knights and sergeants, professional soldiers granted smaller estates. They formed the core of Crusader armies. A typical knight held enough land to support himself, his horse, and his equipment. In return, he owed military service, usually 40 days per year. But 40 days was insufficient for long campaigns. So the Crusader states developed monetary payments called scutage. Knights could pay instead of serving, allowing kings to hire mercenaries. This system was more flexible but required constant revenue. Taxation was complex. The Crusader states taxed agriculture, trade, and urban production. Muslim and Jewish communities paid special taxes. The market tax, paid at city gates, was a significant revenue source. Italian merchants negotiated tax exemptions in exchange for naval support, reducing royal income but securing essential shipping. The church was economically powerful. Monasteries and bishoprics held vast estates. They collected tithes and controlled pilgrimage sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre generated enormous revenue from pilgrims. Donations poured in from across Christian Europe. Some of this wealth funded charity and hospitals. Much enriched church officials. Military orders operated outside normal feudal structure. Templars and Hospitallers held castles and estates directly, not as vassals. They maintained standing armies, permanent garrisons of knight brothers who had taken monastic vows. This was revolutionary. Most medieval armies were temporary, assembled for campaigns then disbanded. The orders provided professional, disciplined troops year-round. The Templars developed sophisticated financial operations. They loaned money to kings and nobles. They managed estates across Europe and the East. Their Paris temple became an early central bank. This wealth funded castle construction and military campaigns. It also bred resentment. People whispered that Templars cared more for gold than God. Urban governance varied by city. Acre, Tyre, and other coastal cities had substantial Italian merchant communities. Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans each controlled separate quarters with their own laws and courts. They maintained private armies and sometimes fought each other in the streets. These Italian communities were semi-independent states within states. The indigenous population, mostly Muslims and Eastern Christians, lived under Crusader rule with varying degrees of autonomy. Muslims in rural areas continued farming, paying taxes to new lords. In cities, Muslim craftsmen and merchants operated relatively freely, though they paid higher taxes than Christians. Eastern Christians, following Orthodox or other non-Roman traditions, had complex relationships with Crusaders. The Latin Church insisted on supremacy, often installing Latin bishops over Greek or Syrian Orthodox communities. This created resentment. Eastern Christians had lived in the region for centuries. They saw Crusaders as foreign occupiers as much as protectors. Legal systems were plural. Latin Christians followed European feudal law. The Assizes of Jerusalem, a law code developed in the Crusader kingdom, codified feudal customs. Eastern Christians and Muslims used their own communal laws for internal matters. Only disputes between communities went to Crusader courts. Slavery existed but was limited. Prisoners of war could be enslaved. Domestic servants in noble households were sometimes unfree. But large-scale plantation slavery like later periods did not exist. Most agricultural labor was performed by free or semi-free peasants. Communication with Europe was maintained through pilgrims, merchants, and church officials. Letters traveled slowly, taking months. News of battles reached Europe long after outcomes were decided. This isolation forced Crusader leaders to act independently, unable to wait for European guidance. Supply lines were critical and vulnerable. Food, weapons, and reinforcements came primarily by sea. Controlling ports was existential. Loss of a major port could cripple an entire region. Italian navies were essential partners, not servants. Kings negotiated with Genoa or Venice as near equals, granting privileges in exchange for ships. The military system combined heavy cavalry with infantry. Crusader knights were shock troops, devastating when they charged. But they were few, perhaps 600 to 1,000 knights in the Kingdom of Jerusalem at any time. They needed support from infantry, archers, and light cavalry recruited from local Christian and converted Muslim populations called Turcopoles. Castles were the defensive backbone. These were not romantic fairy tale castles but brutal military fortresses. Thick walls, murder holes, and overlapping fields of fire made them nearly impregnable. A small garrison could hold a castle against a much larger force. As long as supply lines held, castles controlled territories. This system worked barely. It required constant vigilance, endless negotiation, and frequent military action. It was expensive, exhausting, and fragile, but for decades it held. The year 1171 marked a turning point, though few recognized it then. Saladin, the Kurdish general serving the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt, seized power in Cairo. He ended the Fatimid Caliphate and declared loyalty to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This seemingly internal Muslim political shift would doom the Crusader states. Saladin was different from previous Muslim leaders the Crusaders faced. He combined military skill with political genius and genuine religious devotion. He presented himself as a champion of jihad, holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. Unlike the fractured Muslim princes before him, Saladin worked methodically to unite Muslim territories under his control. He conquered Syria, absorbing Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul. By the 1180s, he ruled a unified Muslim empire surrounding the Crusader states on three sides. The strategic situation reversed. Now the Crusaders were islands in a Muslim sea. Yet in Jerusalem, crisis loomed from within. King Baldwin IV came to power in 1174 at age 13. He was intelligent, brave, and capable. He was also a leper. His disease progressed relentlessly. His face disfigured. His hands and feet lost feeling. He could barely hold a sword. Yet he led armies into battle, his body literally falling apart. Baldwin's illness created a succession crisis. He had no children. His heir was his sister Sibylla and her son, also named Baldwin. But Sibylla married Guy of Lusignan, a French noble despised by much of the Jerusalem nobility. They saw Guy as incompetent and arrogant. Factions formed. The kingdom split between those supporting Guy and those wanting alternative succession. In 1183, Saladin invaded in force. He besieged Carrick Castle during a wedding celebration. The castle held. Saladin withdrew. In 1184, he invaded again, ravaging the countryside. Again, the Crusaders avoided pitched battle, relying on castle defenses. Saladin could not sustain long sieges. His army, composed of vassals and tribal warriors, demanded to return home after campaigns. Baldwin IV died in 1185, aged 24, his body consumed by disease. His nephew, the child Baldwin V, became king but died within a year. The throne passed to Sibylla and Guy. The kingdom now had a king many nobles refused to follow. One noble particularly resented Guy's authority, Raynald of Châtillon. Raynald was a brutal warrior who ruled Carrick and Altrajordan, territories east of the Dead Sea. He loved raiding Muslim caravans. In 1187, he attacked a caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. Saladin's sister was reportedly among the travelers. This was the final provocation. Saladin declared jihad. He assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, perhaps 30,000 men. He invaded Galilee in July 1187. King Guy gathered the Crusader army, about 20,000 men including 1,200 knights. This was nearly every fighting man the kingdom could muster. To lose this army was to lose everything. The Crusaders marched from Sephuria toward Tiberias, where Saladin besieged the castle. The July heat was brutal. The route crossed dry hills with no water. Saladin's light cavalry harassed the column constantly. Arrows fell like rain. Horses collapsed. Men suffered heat stroke. By the evening of July 3rd, the Crusaders reached the Horns of Hattin, a pair of volcanic hills. They were exhausted, thirsty, desperate. Saladin's army surrounded them. Muslim soldiers set fire to the dry grass. Smoke choked the Crusaders. Through the night, Muslims beat drums and chanted verses from the Quran. The Crusaders could not sleep, could not rest, could not escape. At dawn on July 4th, Saladin attacked. The Crusader infantry broke first, fleeing uphill toward the horns. Knights tried to charge but were isolated, surrounded. Some fought to the death. Others surrendered. King Guy and his barons were captured. The battle was over by afternoon. Saladin treated noble prisoners with respect, offering Guy water to drink. But when Raynald was brought before him, Saladin personally executed him with his sword, avenging Raynald's attacks on Muslim pilgrims. Saladin ordered all captured Templars and Hospitallers killed. He considered them too dangerous to ransom or release. The Battle of Hattin destroyed Crusader military power in one afternoon. Without an army, castles and cities could not hold. Within weeks, Saladin captured dozens of strongholds. Garrisons, knowing no relief was coming, negotiated surrender. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem. Inside were civilians, clergy, and a tiny garrison. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles to escape Hattin, led the defense. He knew resistance was hopeless. He negotiated surrender terms. Christians would be allowed to leave if they paid ransom. Those who could not pay would become slaves. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. He ordered the cross removed from the Dome of the Rock and had it dragged through the streets. But he did not massacre the population. He allowed Christians to leave safely. He permitted Orthodox Christians to remain. His restraint contrasted starkly with the Crusader slaughter of 1099. Europe received the news in shock and horror. Jerusalem, the holy city, was lost. The Crusader dream seemed over. The fall of Jerusalem reverberated through Europe like an earthquake. When messengers arrived in Rome, Paris, and London carrying news of Hattin and Saladin's conquest, disbelief gave way to grief and rage. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade, the Third. The response was unprecedented. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs took the cross. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England all pledged to reclaim Jerusalem. This was the greatest military mobilization since the First Crusade. Hope surged that Christian armies would sweep away Saladin and restore the kingdom. Frederick Barbarossa departed first in 1189 with a massive German army. He was nearly 70 but still vigorous and determined. His army marched overland through Byzantine territory and into Anatolia. They fought several victorious battles against Turkish forces. Everything seemed possible. Then, on June 10, 1190, while crossing a river in Cilicia, Frederick drowned. Some sources say he fell from his horse. Others say he tried to swim and succumbed to cold water. His death was sudden and shocking. The German army disintegrated. Some soldiers returned home. Others continued but arrived in the Holy Land weakened and demoralized. The great hope of German power vanished with one old man drowning in a river. Richard and Philip arrived by sea in 1191. They found the Crusader remnants besieging Acre, the kingdom's largest port. The siege had begun in 1189 and dragged on for 2 years. Thousands died from disease and starvation on both sides. The arrival of French and English armies tipped the balance. Acre surrendered in July 1191. But almost immediately, Richard and Philip quarreled. They were rivals, not allies. Philip, claiming illness, returned to France. Richard remained. He would become legend. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king. His military skill was undeniable. He was brave, charismatic, and ruthless. Richard marched south from Acre toward Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed him, refusing pitched battle after witnessing Richard's tactical brilliance at Arsuf. Richard captured Jaffa and came within sight of Jerusalem's walls. His army camped in the hills, gazing at the holy city. But Richard understood siege warfare. Taking Jerusalem was possible. Holding it was not. His supply lines stretched back to Acre. Saladin could cut it. Winter rains would trap them. And even if successful, European monarchs could not stay permanently. They had kingdoms to rule. Twice Richard approached Jerusalem. Twice he turned back. His soldiers wept with frustration. They had come so far. The goal was visible. Yet their king denied them. Richard negotiated instead. In September 1192, he signed a truce with Saladin. Christians could visit Jerusalem as pilgrims. The Crusaders kept a coastal strip from Jaffa to Tyre. Jerusalem remained Muslim. Richard departed in October 1192. He had saved the Crusader presence in the Levant. He had restored some territory, but he had not reclaimed Jerusalem. The Third Crusade, despite its glory and the king's prowess, was a strategic failure. It stabilized the situation but did not reverse Saladin's conquests. Saladin died in 1193, just months after Richard left. His empire fragmented immediately. His sons and brothers fought over territories. The unified Muslim front dissolved back into competing principalities. This gave the Crusaders breathing room, but the damage was done. Jerusalem was gone. The kingdom was reduced to a rump state clinging to the coast. the Crusader states entered a new phase: survival, not expansion. Kings ruled from Acre, not Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem existed in name, but its heart was Muslim-controlled. This psychological blow was devastating. The entire Crusader project had been justified by controlling holy sites. Now those sites were in enemy hands, accessible only by Muslim permission. European enthusiasm for crusading began to wane. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never reached the Holy Land. Instead, it attacked Constantinople in 1204, sacking the Christian Byzantine capital. Crusaders looted churches, murdered Orthodox Christians, and established a Latin empire. This atrocity permanently embittered relations between Western and Eastern Christianity. It also demonstrated that crusading motives had become corrupted. Greed and politics now drove expeditions as much as faith. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, targeted Egypt, hoping to strike at Muslim power's economic heart. It achieved initial success, capturing Damietta, but the Crusaders overextended, rejecting generous peace offers. The Nile flooded, trapping them. They were forced to surrender and evacuate Egypt. Emperor Frederick II launched the Sixth Crusade in 1228, arriving excommunicated by the Pope for delaying. Frederick did not fight. He negotiated. Through diplomacy, he secured Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth through a 10-year truce. He crowned himself King of Jerusalem in 1229. It was a bloodless triumph. But this diplomatic victory was hollow. Jerusalem's walls were not rebuilt. The city was vulnerable. Muslim authorities retained control of the Temple Mount. And within 15 years, Jerusalem was lost again, retaken by Muslim forces in 1244 after a new Mongol-Turkish force, the Khwarezmians, ravaged the region. Each crusade achieved less than the one before. Each expedition faced more cynicism at home. Kings demanded new taxes to fund campaigns. Preachers struggled to recruit fighters. The narrative that God favored crusaders became harder to believe when crusades kept failing. In the Crusader states themselves, the population became increasingly native. Children born in Outremer, as the Crusader East was called, knew no other home. They were culturally hybrid, speaking Arabic, wearing Eastern dress, and intermarrying with local Christians. European visitors found them strange and suspect. The military orders remained strong, but they also grew insular and arrogant. Templars and Hospitallers pursued independent policies, sometimes contradicting royal strategy. They held the best castles and richest estates. Their power rivaled kings. This created resentment and dysfunction. The cracks that began at Hattin widened with each passing decade. The Crusader states survived but did not thrive. They became a curiosity, exotic outposts maintained by European money and occasional military reinforcement. Their end was no longer a question of if, but when. The mid-1200s brought new hope in the form of King Louis IX of France, later St. Louis. He was perhaps the most genuinely pious monarch to take the cross. Louis launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, targeting Egypt again. He personally financed the expedition, impoverishing his kingdom's treasury. Initially successful, Louis captured Damietta in 1249, but his advance on Cairo stalled. Disease ravaged his army. The Nile's flooding channels and Muslim resistance bogged down the French. In April 1250, at the Battle of Ferriscourt, the Crusaders were routed. Louis himself was captured. His ransom was enormous: 400,000 livres, roughly half of France's annual revenue. The Muslim Mamluk dynasty, slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, released him only after this payment and the return of Damietta. Louis did not return home. Instead, he spent 4 years in Acre trying to fortify Crusader defenses. He paid for new walls, negotiated truces, and mediated disputes among Crusader nobles. Louis finally returned to France in 1254, but the crusade had bankrupted his kingdom and achieved nothing lasting. His personal sanctity grew his legend, but strategically, the Seventh Crusade was another failure. Meanwhile, a new power emerged from the east: the Mongols. In the 1240s and 1250s, Mongol armies swept across Asia and into the Middle East. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, sacking Baghdad with unimaginable brutality. Muslim civilization's greatest city burned for weeks. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. Some crusaders saw them as potential allies against Islam. Mongol envoys visited Crusader courts. Diplomatic letters were exchanged. The prospect of a grand Christian-Mongol alliance against Muslim powers tantalized European imagination. But the Mongols were not Christians seeking partners. They were conquerors demanding submission. In 1260, a Mongol army invaded Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus. They approached the Crusader states. Some Crusader lords offered assistance. Others wisely remained neutral. The decisive moment came at Ain Jalut in September 1260. The Mamluks of Egypt, led by Sultan Qutuz and his general Baibars, met the Mongols in battle in Galilee. Against expectations, the Mamluks won decisively. The Mongol advance stopped. The myth of Mongol invincibility shattered. Baibars seized power in Egypt shortly after killing Qutuz. He would prove the most dangerous enemy the Crusaders ever faced. Baibars was a brilliant strategist and utterly ruthless. He saw the Crusader states as a cancer to be excised. Beginning in 1263, Baibars launched systematic campaigns. He did not seek conquest alone but annihilation. He captured castles through siege or treachery. He massacred garrisons. He destroyed fortifications so Crusaders could not reoccupy them. He slaughtered populations to break Christian morale. In 1265, Baibars took Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266, he captured the Templar castle of Safed after a siege, promising the garrison safe passage if they surrendered. They did. He then executed every Templar, breaking his oath. The message was clear: no mercy. In 1268, Baibars captured Antioch, one of the original Crusader principalities. The city had stood for 170 years. His fall was catastrophic. Baibars butchered the population. He wrote a taunting letter to the absent Prince of Antioch, describing in detail the slaughter and destruction. Antioch never recovered. Its ruins stand empty today. The Crusader response was weak, divided. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had no effective king. Rival Italian merchant factions fought in the streets of Acre. Templars and Hospitallers pursued conflicting policies. Appeals to Europe brought little aid. Crusading fervor had exhausted itself. Louis IX tried one more time. In 1270, he launched the Eighth Crusade, but this time toward Tunis in North Africa, attempting to convert the Hafsid Sultan and establish a base. It was an inexplicable strategy. The crusade landed in Tunisia in July. Disease struck immediately. Louis fell ill. On August 25, 1270, he died, lying on a bed of ashes in penance. His last words were, "Jerusalem." His crusade ended before it began. The 1270s and 1280s saw the final unraveling. Baibars died in 1277, possibly poisoned. But his successors continued his policies. Sultan Kalawan besieged Margit, forcing the Hospitallers to surrender in 1285. Tripoli fell in 1289 after a horrific siege. When the city was taken, the Mamluks massacred everyone, selling survivors into slavery. Only Acre remained, the last significant Crusader stronghold. It was crowded with refugees, soldiers, merchants, and clergy. Everyone knew the end approached, yet life continued. Markets operated. Ships arrived and departed. Denial and desperation coexisted. In April 1291, Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil, Kalawan's son, arrived before Acre with an enormous army and massive siege engines. The walls were strong, recently reinforced. Defenders included Templars, Hospitallers, and soldiers from Cyprus and Europe. They numbered about 15,000 against perhaps 200,000 besiegers. The siege lasted 6 weeks. Mamluk siege engines pounded the walls day and night. Towers crumbled. Breaches opened. The defenders repaired frantically, fighting by day, rebuilding by night. On May 18th, the Mamluks launched a final assault. They poured through breaches in overwhelming numbers. The slaughter was immense. Knights fought to the death. Civilians fled to the harbor. desperate for ships. Many drowned trying to swim to vessels. The Templar fortress held longest, falling on May 28th after the Grand Master and remaining knights died fighting. Acre's fall ended the Crusader presence. The remaining coastal strongholds, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, were evacuated immediately. There was no point defending them. By August 1291, every Crusader territory was abandoned. 2 centuries of Christian rule in the Holy Land ended. The Mamluks systematically destroyed every fortification, church, and port facility to prevent any return. They wanted to ensure no Crusader could ever use these sites again. The coastline became desolate, a wasteland of ruins. The refugees from Acre arrived in Cyprus carrying nothing but trauma. They brought stories of slaughter, of children trampled in panicked crowds, of knights fighting hopeless last stands. Ships sailed overladen, some sinking within sight of land. The survivors who reached Europe were broken men and women. In Cyprus, Templars and Hospitallers maintained headquarters, but without territory to defend, their purpose became unclear. The Templars especially faced an existential crisis. They were warrior monks without a war, bankers holding enormous wealth with no clear mission. King Philip IV of France saw opportunity in the Templars' vulnerability. He was deeply in debt to the order. Destroying them would cancel his obligations and seize their wealth. He needed a pretext. He found it in accusations of heresy. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip's agents arrested every Templar in France simultaneously. They were charged with denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and sexual perversion. Under torture, many confessed. The confessions were likely false, extracted through agony. Pope Clement V, under Philip's pressure, dissolved the Templar order in 1312. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. Legend says he cursed Philip and Clement from the flames. Both died within the year. The Templars, who had defended the Holy Land for 2 centuries, ended in disgrace and ashes. The Hospitallers continued, relocating to Rhodes and later Malta. They transformed into a naval power, fighting Muslim pirates and Ottoman fleets. They survived into the modern era, eventually becoming the Humanitarian Order of Malta. But their military glory days were finished. Europe struggled to process the loss. 200 years of blood, treasure, and faith had ended in complete defeat. Theologians debated why God had abandoned the Crusaders. Some argued Christians had sinned, grown too worldly and corrupt. Others blamed poor leadership or insufficient commitment. Few questioned whether Crusades themselves were flawed. The psychological impact was profound. Medieval Christianity had built its identity partly around holy war. Crusading was how knights proved devotion, how kings demonstrated piety, how the church asserted moral authority. Now that entire framework collapsed. Chronicles written after 1291 are filled with bitterness and confusion. Writers searched for explanations. They blamed the Italians for fighting each other instead of Muslims. They blamed the military orders for pride and independence. They blamed European monarchs for abandoning the Holy Land. Everyone blamed someone else. The practical consequences rippled through Europe. Crusade taxes had funded papal projects and royal ambitions. Those revenue streams ended. The Italian maritime cities lost profitable eastern trade routes, though they eventually adapted by developing alternative commercial networks. The cultural impact was complex. Crusading ideals had shaped European knighthood. Chivalric romances celebrated warrior pilgrims fighting for Christ. The collapse forced a reimagining. Knights became courtly lovers in literature, pursuing ladies rather than holy cities. The secular replaced the sacred in aristocratic culture. Yet crusading ideology did not die. It evolved. The Reconquista in Spain continued, casting the struggle against Muslim Granada as a crusade. The Teutonic Knights redirected their energies toward conquering and converting pagans in the Baltic. Crusading rhetoric justified colonialism and religious wars for centuries. The breaking point of 1291 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Medieval Christendom's confident expansion halted. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem governed by European knights died in Acre's ruins. For Muslims, the victory was triumphant but Pyrrhic. The Mamluks deliberately devastated the Levantine coast to prevent Crusader return. This destroyed local economies. Ports silted up. Trade declined. The region entered economic depression that lasted centuries. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands died across the Crusades. Entire communities were wiped out. Jewish populations in Europe suffered pogroms as Crusaders passed through. Eastern Christians were caught between Western invaders and Muslim rulers, trusted by neither. The break was not clean. Crusade proposals continued for decades. In 1309, the Pope called for a new expedition. Nothing materialized. In 1365, King Peter of Cyprus raided Alexandria but could not hold it. These were shadows of earlier efforts, brief raids rather than sustained campaigns. The Mongol conversion to Islam in the late 1200s closed the last possibility of a non-Muslim ally in the East. The dream of a Christian-Mongol alliance against Islam died with Mongol Khans accepting Muslim faith. By 1300, the Crusader age had definitively ended. The breaking point was past. What remained was memory, legacy, and unhealed wounds. After the fall of Acre, scattered communities of former Crusaders spread across the Mediterranean. Cyprus became the primary refuge. The Lusignan dynasty, former kings of Jerusalem, ruled the island. They maintained the pretense of being rightful kings of Jerusalem despite holding no territory there. This fiction persisted for generations. Cyprus prospered temporarily from refugee skills and capital. Craftsmen, merchants, and knights brought expertise. The island became a cultural blend, French nobility ruling Greek peasants with Italian merchants facilitating trade. Gothic cathedrals rose in Cypriot cities, architectural reminders of lost mainland kingdoms. The military orders adapted differently. The Hospitallers conquered Rhodes in 1309 after years of preparation. From this island base, they became a naval power. Their galleys patrolled the eastern Mediterranean, protecting Christian shipping and raiding Muslim coasts. They built massive fortifications, still standing today, that withstood Ottoman sieges for decades. The Teutonic Knights, who had played a smaller role in the Holy Land, shifted entirely to the Baltic. They conquered Prussia, converting pagan populations by force. They established a theocratic state that lasted until the Reformation. Their northern crusade succeeded where the eastern one failed. Individual survivors carried memories home. Veterans told stories in European villages. Some became monks seeking redemption for wartime violence. Others could not readjust, drifting as mercenaries or bandits. The psychological trauma had no name then, but chronicles describe knights haunted by what they had seen and done. Knowledge transferred in scattered ways. Arabic medical texts were translated into Latin. European doctors learned surgical techniques observed in the East. Spices and crops introduced during Crusader rule continued to be imported. Sugar especially became a European luxury good, its production methods learned from Eastern mills. Architectural influences appeared in European castles. Concentric walls, a design perfected in Crusader fortifications, were adopted in England and Wales. Edward I's Welsh castles show clear Eastern influence. The idea of combined military and residential functions in castles became standard. Crusader laws influenced European legal systems. The Assizes of Jerusalem, the law code of the Crusader kingdom, was studied as a model of feudal governance. It influenced legal thinking about vassalage, inheritance, and royal prerogatives. Languages preserved traces. French absorbed Arabic words through Crusader contact. Terms for military equipment, textiles, and foods entered European vocabularies. The word arsenal comes from Arabic dar al-Sina'a, a workshop. Admiral derives from Arabic amir. Religious relics, genuine or fabricated, flooded Europe. Every crusader returned claiming to possess fragments of the true cross, thorns from Christ's crown, or bones of saints. Cathedrals and monasteries accumulated these objects, attracting pilgrims and revenue. Authentication was impossible. Faith made them real. The Templars, though destroyed as an order, lived on in legend. Conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately. Stories claimed surviving Templars escaped with secret treasure or knowledge. These myths grew over centuries, eventually spawning fiction about holy grails, ancient wisdom, and hidden brotherhoods. The reality, impoverished tortured men, was forgotten. Art preserved Crusader imagery. Manuscript illuminations depicted armored knights battling Saracens. Church frescoes showed Jerusalem's conquest. These images shaped European perceptions of the East for generations. Muslims were depicted as dark-skinned villains, distortions that reinforced prejudice. Families preserved lineage connections to crusading ancestors. Claiming descent from a crusader became a mark of nobility. Coats of arms incorporated crosses and Eastern symbols. Genealogies were sometimes invented to create crusading pedigrees where none existed. The memory of unified Christian purpose haunted Europe. Later popes invoked crusading rhetoric when seeking military support. Emperor Charles V in the 1500s styled his wars against Ottomans as crusades. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was blessed as a crusade against Protestant England. The term became elastic, applied to any conflict church authorities wished to sanctify. Eastern Christian communities, Maronites, Armenians, and others, preserved different memories. They remembered Crusaders as brutal occupiers who disrupted centuries-old accommodations with Muslims. These communities paid prices for Crusader invasions long after Europeans left. Muslim rulers sometimes took vengeance on local Christians for Western sins. Archaeological remnants endured. Crusader castles, though often ruined, remained landmarks. Some were rebuilt by later rulers. Croix de Chevaliers in Syria survived relatively intact until damaged in modern warfare. These structures testified to Crusader engineering skill and strategic thinking. Coins minted in Crusader states circulated for decades. Museums now hold these artifacts: gold bezants and silver deniers bearing crosses and Latin inscriptions. They are tangible proof of a society that existed and functioned for generations. What remained was fragmentary, scattered across continents and cultures. The Crusades left no unified legacy but countless small inheritances, some creative, many destructive, all testifying to a period when worlds collided violently. The Crusades ended physically in 1291 but continued in European imagination for centuries. Each generation reimagined them according to contemporary needs and anxieties. The historical reality was complex and morally ambiguous. The legend became simplified, romanticized, weaponized. Medieval chroniclers, writing within decades of events, were already creating mythology. They exaggerated Crusader piety while minimizing greed and brutality. They inflated Muslim numbers to make Christian victories seem more miraculous. They portrayed Saladin as a chivalrous adversary, a noble enemy who proved Christian values were universal. By the 1300s, poets and romance writers transformed Crusades into adventure tales. The Chanson de Roland, though set centuries earlier, was reinterpreted through crusading lens. Godfrey of Bouillon became a hero in epic poems, a perfect Christian knight. Realities complicated, often venal man disappeared behind legend. The Renaissance brought new perspectives. Humanist scholars began critically examining Crusade chronicles, noting contradictions and exaggerations. But even skeptics maintained that Crusades, whatever their flaws, represented Christianity's strength and unity. The Protestant Reformation complicated Crusade legacy. Protestant thinkers criticized Crusades as papal corruption, examples of Catholicism's worldliness. They argued true Christianity spread through preaching, not swords. Catholic writers defended Crusades as legitimate defense of Christendom. The same events became Protestant and Catholic propaganda. The Enlightenment brought harsher judgment. Voltaire and other philosophers condemned Crusades as barbaric fanaticism. They saw them as proof of religion's destructive power. Edward Gibbon's massive history portrayed Crusades as feudal wastes motivated by superstition. Enlightenment thinkers used Crusades to critique contemporary religious authority. The Romantic period reversed this again. 19th century writers and artists rediscovered medieval chivalry. Sir Walter Scott's novels depicted crusades as noble enterprises. Paintings showed gallant knights and exotic eastern landscapes. The Victorian era loved Crusader imagery, seeing parallels to British imperial expansion. This romantic reimagining had real consequences. European colonial powers in the 1800s and 1900s explicitly invoked Crusader precedent. French General Gouraud, entering Damascus in 1920 after defeating Ottoman forces, reportedly visited Saladin's tomb and said, "We have returned." Whether this actually happened or is apocryphal matters less than that people believed it could happen. The creation of Israel in 1948 triggered new crusade analogies. Arab nationalists compared Zionism to Crusader colonialism, temporary Western implants destined to fail. Israeli narratives sometimes embraced Crusader parallels, seeing themselves as returning exiles reclaiming ancestral land. Both sides instrumentalized history. Modern Islamic fundamentalism invokes crusades constantly. Osama bin Laden repeatedly called Americans Crusaders, and jihad against the West as completing Saladin's work. This rhetoric resonates in the Muslim world where crusades are taught as unprovoked Western aggression. The term Crusader Zionist merges historical and contemporary grievances. Ironically, medieval Muslims did not see crusades as civilizational conflicts. Contemporary Arab chronicles often describe Crusaders as Franks, just another barbarian invasion like many before. The religious dimensions were noted but not considered definitive. Only in modern times did crusades become central to Muslim historical consciousness. Academic historians struggle with this legacy. They try to present balanced accounts acknowledging complexity. Religious devotion and greed, heroism and atrocity existed simultaneously. But nuanced history rarely shapes public memory. The Catholic Church's relationship with crusade legacy evolved. In 2000, Pope John Paul II apologized for historical sins including Crusader violence. This marked significant shift. For centuries, the Church celebrated crusades. Now it acknowledged their dark aspects. Popular culture continuously reinvents crusades. Video games like Assassin's Creed present them as struggles between good and evil. Historical accuracy matters less than dramatic storytelling. Films from Kingdom of Heaven to documentaries offer competing interpretations. The architectural legacy remains visible. Gothic cathedrals across Europe were partly funded by crusade donations. Crusading orders built churches, hospitals, and fortifications still standing. Walking through medieval European cities, you encounter physical remnants of crusading wealth and influence. The concept of holy war influenced Western military culture. The idea that violence for righteous causes is noble rather than sinful echoes crusading theology. Modern just war theory partly descends from arguments developed to justify crusades. The legacy is ultimately paradoxical. Crusades failed militarily but succeeded culturally. They did not permanently secure Jerusalem but permanently shaped how Europe saw itself and others. They created enduring stereotypes, bitter memories, and unresolved historical arguments. Every invocation of crusades today, whether by Western politicians or jihadist ideologues, distorts history. The Crusades were products of specific medieval circumstances. Using them to justify modern actions is anachronistic. Yet the anachronisms persist because the Crusades occupy a symbolic space beyond mere history. For centuries after their end, the physical sites of Crusader activity remained but were forgotten by Europeans. Ottoman Turkish rule of the region from 1517 discouraged Christian pilgrimage and exploration. The castles crumbled. The cities were rebuilt according to new patterns. Layers of history accumulated over Crusader remains. The 19th century brought European travelers back to the Levant. They came as tourists, archaeologists, and imperial agents. What they found astonished them. Crusader castles still stood, massive and imposing despite centuries of neglect. Croix de Chevaliers particularly impressed visitors. Its concentric walls and preserved architecture demonstrated medieval engineering sophistication. Early archaeologists were treasure hunters as much as scholars. They excavated Crusader sites seeking artifacts for European museums. Many objects were removed from context, their historical relationships destroyed. But these expeditions did produce the first systematic studies of Crusader material culture. The founding of academic archaeology brought more rigorous methods. French scholars, leveraging colonial presence in Syria and Lebanon, conducted extensive surveys. They mapped Crusader fortifications, traced trade routes, and studied urban planning. Their work revealed that Crusader states were more developed and organized than previously assumed. British archaeologists working in Palestine before World War I excavated Crusader churches and administrative buildings. They found evidence of sophisticated water management systems, public baths, and market structures. The Crusaders had not simply imposed European models but adapted to local conditions. Archives across Europe yielded documentary treasures. Charters, letters, and account books preserved in monasteries and noble estates were catalogued. These documents revealed economic details, tax rates, trade agreements, property transfers. They showed how Crusader states actually functioned day to day. The development of medieval studies as an academic discipline in the early 1900s brought critical analysis. Scholars compared Muslim, Byzantine, and Latin Christian sources. Contradictions between accounts became apparent. Claims of massive armies were revealed as exaggerations. Motivations appeared more complex than simple religious zeal. After World War II, archaeology advanced technologically. Carbon dating, pottery analysis, and architectural study refined chronologies. Excavations revealed layers of occupation showing how sites evolved. A Crusader church might have been built over a Byzantine structure which itself replaced a Roman temple. History was multilayered, not linear. Israeli archaeology after 1948 focused extensively on Crusader remains. Excavations at Caesarea, Acre, and Arsuf uncovered urban plans. Israeli scholars published extensively on Crusader agriculture, economy, and settlement patterns. However, this research sometimes served nationalist narratives, emphasizing Jewish presence before and after Crusaders while minimizing continuous Arab habitation. Arab scholarship developed its own Crusades historiography. Syrian, Lebanese, and Egyptian historians examined Arabic chronicles more thoroughly. They highlighted Muslim perspectives, agency, and achievements. Saladin was studied not just as Crusader opponent but as complex politician navigating intricate regional dynamics. By the late 20th century, truly interdisciplinary approaches emerged. Historians collaborated with archaeologists, numismatists, art historians, and scientists. Analysis of building techniques revealed cross-cultural influences. Crusader masons learned from Muslim architects. Design elements merged European and Eastern traditions. DNA analysis of Crusader-era burial sites provided surprising results. European genetic markers mixed with local populations more than expected. This suggested intermarriage and cultural blending beyond what chronicles admitted. The genetic evidence complicated narratives of pure European settler colonialism. Climate studies revealed that the Crusader period coincided with the medieval warm period. Harvests were more reliable. Populations grew. This context helped explain both European expansion capacity and Middle Eastern demographic patterns. Environmental factors shaped history as much as human decisions. Modern debates continue about interpretation. Was crusading primarily religious, economic, or political? Scholars find evidence for all three. The question itself may be anachronistic, imposing modern categorical divisions on medieval people who saw no contradiction between serving God and seeking fortune. The greatest mystery remains human motivation. Why did hundreds of thousands of people march toward probable death? Chronicles provide answers, but they are official explanations. The illiterate peasant who sewed a cross to his tunic left no written record explaining his reasons. We can only infer from actions preserved in archaeological traces and brief chronicle mentions. What survives challenges simplistic narratives. Crusader coins show pragmatism, using Arabic inscriptions to facilitate trade. Architectural remains show adaptation, incorporating local materials and techniques. Legal documents show negotiation, contracts between Crusaders and Muslims governing commerce and conflict. The physical remnants scattered across the eastern Mediterranean testify to presence but not meaning. Castle walls stand mute. Only through painstaking study, combining multiple disciplines and perspectives, can we approach understanding what the Crusades meant to those who lived them. Beyond the battles and politics, the Crusades reveal profound patterns about human nature and civilizations. They show how faith can inspire both nobility and atrocity. They demonstrate that cultural contact creates hybridity even amid conflict. They prove that imperial projects, however confidently launched, can collapse utterly. The first pattern is the power of belief. Crusaders genuinely thought God commanded their violence. This certainty enabled extraordinary courage and horrifying cruelty. Men marched thousands of miles, endured starvation, and died in desert heat believing salvation awaited. This same belief justified massacring civilians and destroying ancient communities. Modern people struggle to understand this mentality. We compartmentalize religion and politics. Medieval people did not. For them, the spiritual and material were inseparable. Taking Jerusalem was both military conquest and cosmic drama. This fusion of worldly and sacred made Crusades possible. It also made them brutal. The second pattern concerns identity formation through conflict. Before the Crusades, Europe barely existed as a concept. People identified as French, German, or English. Crusading created a shared identity as Christians fighting Muslims. These categories hardened through opposition. The enemy defined the self. This dynamic continues today. Conflict creates coherence. Shared enemies unite fractious groups temporarily. But such unity is brittle, dissolving once external pressure lifts. Crusader unity rarely lasted past immediate crises. The moment Saladin retreated, European crusaders fought each other. The third pattern is adaptation versus ideology. Crusaders who actually lived in the Levant adapted constantly. They learned Arabic, made alliances with Muslims, and adopted local customs. Their survival depended on flexibility. But newcomers from Europe, arriving full of ideological fervor, saw this adaptation as betrayal. They wanted pure holy war, not pragmatic coexistence. This tension between ideology and reality destroys imperial projects. Empires cannot function on ideological purity. They require negotiation, compromise, and local knowledge. Yet the ideology that motivates imperial expansion forbids such compromises. This contradiction doomed the Crusader states. The fourth pattern involves memory and myth. Crusades were failures by any objective measure. They achieved no lasting territorial gains. They did not permanently change the region's religious character. Yet European culture remembers them as glorious. Why? Because stories matter more than facts. The Crusades became narratives about courage, faith, and struggle against impossible odds. These stories served psychological and political needs. They allowed Europeans to imagine themselves as active, masculine, and righteous. The facts were less important than what the stories provided. The fifth pattern is unintended consequences. The Crusades aimed to strengthen Christianity. They permanently divided Eastern and Western Christianity. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople created wounds never healed. Orthodox Christians still remember Latin Crusader betrayal. Similarly, Crusades strengthened Islam's sense of unity against external threat. Before Crusades, Islamic civilization was fragmenting politically. The presence of Christian invaders created common cause. Saladin's legitimacy partly derived from his success against Crusaders. Ironically, the Christian Holy War revitalized Muslim identity. The sixth pattern concerns violence and religion. Critics argue Crusades prove religion causes violence. Defenders argue Crusaders betrayed Christian teachings. Both miss complexity. Religion motivated Crusades, but so did economics, politics, and individual ambition. Religion provided justification and meaning, but not sole causation. Moreover, the Crusaders were extraordinarily violent by even medieval standards. Their massacres shocked contemporary Muslims and Eastern Christians accustomed to warfare. This suggests ideology can intensify violence beyond normal human cruelty. The The belief in absolute divine sanction removes restraints that pragmatic politics impose. The seventh pattern is the persistence of grievance. Crusades ended 700 years ago, yet they remain politically potent symbols. Why does 8th-century-old history still generate passion? Because communities incorporate historical memory into identity. The Crusades became founding traumas or glories, depending on perspective. This demonstrates that history is never truly past. Events are constantly reinterpreted to serve present needs. The Crusades mean different things to different peoples and in different eras. Understanding this multiplicity is crucial. There is no single Crusade narrative, only competing interpretations. The eighth pattern involves cultural exchange amid conflict. Despite warfare, ideas and technologies transferred between civilizations. Europeans learned from Muslims. Muslims adopted some European practices. Trade continued even during active hostilities. Human adaptability and curiosity transcend ideological divisions. This suggests that cultural boundaries are porous. Even enemies influence each other. The Crusades created connections, however violent, that shaped both Christian and Muslim civilizations. The encounter, though destructive, was also creative, generating new artistic styles, technologies, and ideas. Finally, the Crusades teach humility about historical judgment. Medieval people acted according to their worldviews. Condemning them from modern perspectives is easy but pointless. Understanding requires imaginative empathy, trying to see the world as they did. This does not mean excusing atrocities but recognizing human complexity. The Crusades were neither purely noble nor purely evil. They were human, filled with courage and cruelty, faith and greed, sacrifice and stupidity. They remind us that people are capable of extraordinary actions, both inspiring and horrifying, when moved by powerful beliefs. The light is fading now. We have traveled together through 2 centuries of bloodshed, faith, and transformation. From Pope Urban's call in Clermont to Acre's final fall, we have walked alongside knights in armor and refugees fleeing burning cities. We have stood on castle walls and watched armies approach through desert heat. What does it all mean? This immense expenditure of life and treasure. The Crusades achieved nothing they intended. Jerusalem was briefly held then lost. The Holy Land remained Muslim. Christian and Muslim civilizations continued separate paths. Measured by goals, the Crusades failed completely. Yet they shaped our world profoundly. They connected civilizations that might have remained separate. They created memories that still influence politics. They demonstrated both human capacity for faith-driven sacrifice and faith-justified atrocity. They remind us that history is made by real people making choices in circumstances they barely understood. Think of the peasant from France who heard a preacher's sermon and decided to take the cross. He sold everything. He walked thousands of miles. He watched friends die from disease, thirst, and arrows. Perhaps he reached Jerusalem. Perhaps he died in Anatolia, his body left for carrion birds. No chronicle remembers his name, but he was real. His hopes and fears were real. Or consider the Muslim farmer in the Galilee whose village was burned by passing Crusaders. He fled with his children into the hills. When he returned, his home was ashes. He rebuilt. He survived. His descendants still walk that land. The Crusades were a chapter in his family's long story, a violent interruption in the rhythm of planting and harvest. The Crusades are not simple stories of good versus evil. They are human stories. They show us at our best and worst, sometimes simultaneously. A knight could pray fervently at dawn and massacre civilians by afternoon without seeing contradiction. A peasant could starve himself to feed his companions, then commit rape during a city's sacking. We cannot undo the past. We cannot apologize away centuries of violence and suffering. But we can remember with honesty. We can acknowledge complexity. We can refuse to weaponize history for contemporary agendas. The castles still stand in Syria and Jordan, though some now bear scars from modern wars. Acre's walls, rebuilt by Ottomans, still face the Mediterranean. Jerusalem's stones, walked by Crusaders and Saladin alike, host new pilgrims. The physical places endure, layered with meanings. If you ever visit Croix de Chevaliers or walk Jerusalem's walls, pause. Imagine the thousands who stood where you stand. They saw the same sun rising over the same hills. They felt the same stone beneath their hands. They were as real as you, as alive in their moment as you are in yours. History is not what happened. History is what we remember and how we remember it. The Crusades happened centuries ago, but the remembering continues. Each generation reshapes the story. You, by listening tonight, become part of that ongoing process. The Crusades teach that certainty is dangerous. The Crusaders were absolutely certain God was on their side. That certainty enabled them to endure hell. It also enabled them to create hell for others. In our own age of competing certainties, this lesson remains vital. They also teach that cultures evolve through contact, even violent contact. European civilization was changed by encountering Islamic civilization. The reverse is equally true. We are shaped by our encounters, especially those that challenge us. Finally, they teach that nothing is permanent. The Crusader kingdoms seemed eternal to those who built them. They invested everything in castles and laws and traditions. Within 2 centuries, all was swept away. Empires rise and fall. Certainties dissolve. What seems permanent proves temporary. Yet human values persist. Courage, loyalty, compassion, cruelty, greed, and faith are constants. The Crusades did not create these. They revealed them operating at grand scale. In the individual knight choosing to save a stranger or commit murder, we see ourselves. So as you prepare to sleep, as the night settles around you, carry these thoughts gently. History is not burden but gift. It shows us what humans have been and therefore what we might become. The Crusades are distant, but their lessons are immediate. The story is told. The candles burn low. Tomorrow brings new concerns. But tonight you have walked with medieval people through their world. You have seen their hopes and witnessed their failures. You have remembered those who lived centuries ago, and in remembering, you have kept them alive. Thank you for journeying with me through the Crusades. Thank you for your attention and your imagination. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow brings, may you carry forward the wisdom that history offers. Humility about our own certainties, compassion for human complexity, and awareness that we too are making history that future generations will judge. Sleep well, my friend. Dream of stone castles and distant deserts, of knights in armor and prayers in ancient languages. History sleeps in you now, waiting to be remembered. Good night.